Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this loose impressionistic wild hollyhock scene. I'm going to be painting it as a line and wash, which means using ink, waterproof ink, to draw the outline first and then to paint it with watercolour paint. Using various washes of colour, and I'll be using a little bit of salt for some effects across the foreground. Today I'm working on Milford 100% cotton cold pressed paper. It's 11 inches by about 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. It's taped to my board, and my board will be at an angle of about 45 degrees for painting so that gravity will help me to paint. I haven't got a reference photograph for this, but what I did, I think, is one of the important things that I always do if I'm sort of painting from my imagination. I look up references for the various elements online, usually on Pixabay, which is a royalty-free site. I then make little sketches of all the elements that I want. In this case it's hollyhocks, but it could be barns or buildings or different types of flowers. Walls, that sort of thing. And I think even if you're painting from your imagination, it's often a very good idea to check references and use those to put your painting together. So you can see here that I've just lightly penciled in my wild hollyhocks with a little bit of implied background, not too much. They're just going to be growing sort of out of a chalky bank, maybe with some sea pinks growing on either side. This is a waterproof fine liner. It's a Pigma Micron 0.8 nib, and I'm just going to simply outline by going over my pencil marks. Just sort of ragged circles with a sort of little central dot in the middle for my open hollyhock blooms. Just little circles and marks to represent leaves, half open buds and stems. Keeping it nice and simple, impressionistic. I'm not getting too bogged down with detail. I'm looking for the overall impression of these hollyhocks rather than trying to produce something that's sort of photorealistic. Line and washes can be quite a sort of stylised medium, so I'm not too worried, as I say, about slavishly copying any of my references. I'm just trying to get something which is sort of pleasing to my eye, and so I'm creating a painting rather than trying to copy any reference exactly. Now this is masking fluid. It's Pebeo drawing gum, and I'm going to mask out the entire hollyhock plant and the sea pinks. This means I can then wash over those areas for my sky and my background freely without worrying about preserving the white of the paper for the very bright blooms. And here you can see the pale blue masking fluid has been deployed over the entire plant. I must leave that to dry completely, and now that it's dry, using a large brush, this is a large or extra large Pro Art Harky brush, I'm going to just wet my page all over. My board's at an angle of 45 degrees, and now I want to try and sort of get an interesting but atmospheric summer sky for these beautiful summer blooms. This is raw sienna, and now this is cerulean blue. And then I shall add in a grey that's been made up of burnt sienna, indigo, and a bit of the cerulean blue, and just draw that across the sky, and then I shall wash it into the sky and across the foreground as well. You can see the paint beginning to run, but it will run and it'll softly diffuse, and hopefully I'll end up with a really interesting sky. Because I'm painting wet in wet, everything's softening back and diffusing. So nice rich paint onto the page, straight from the tube, swept across for my sort of chalky, earthy banks. And here you can see I've used a much richer, drier mix, and I've added burnt umber to the mixture to introduce the banks. But you can see that the paint is still drifting down the page because I'm painting wet in wet, softening back nicely. I don't have a hard edge, but what I do have is some nice plain, simple sort of textured darks. And I've laid my board flat so that my sky won't drift anymore, and using an ordinary plastic store card, I'm etching through the paint just to add some texture and to flatten out the land a bit. The next thing I'm going to do is take some table salt, ordinary table salt, and I'm sprinkling a little bit of it into the rich foreground paint. Hopefully the salt will push away the salt grains will push away the paint and give me these little blooms and give me extra added texture. I now need to leave it to dry completely. So now it's completely dry. I've raised my board back up to 45 degrees and I'm going to carefully rub away my masking fluid. I won't show it all because there's quite a lot here and it'll take a while, but hopefully you can see as those flowers appear how nice they look against the soft washes. So now all I've got to do really is paint in the flowers and the buds, the leaves and the stems, and then maybe just make a few little adjustments just to finish the painting off. So I'm using a small calligraphy brush here and a diluted mixture of opera rose, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paint over my open hollyhock blooms first just to see how they look. Because my board's at an angle of 45 degrees, the wet paint will run down each bloom, so I'll end up with it darker at the bottom and paler at the top. So gravity will actually help to give me my shadows. And if the paint isn't quite light enough at the top, I can dab it out a little bit while it's still damp with a tissue just to make it a little bit lighter. And I'm just leaving my centres unpainted as well because I think that just gives you the little bit of a look of the centres of those flowers and of the stamens in the middle of the flowers. So it's just working across the whole painting and then dotting in the tiny little half-open buds. Not all of them, because some of these I'm going to paint green in a minute. And for that I'm going to use sap green to start with, and then I might add some dark green shadows a bit later on with perylene green. But to start with, it's going to be just putting in the little dots with this sap green. And the nice thing about a line and wash is that everything's there ready for you to paint. You made the decision when you were sketching and then putting in the line work. And so now it's just a matter of adding the colour. So you can see that I'm now painting in my larger leaves as well. And I can do the same with this, just put in a soft, quite a watery wash, and then I can just add in a few little darks, or I can use a tissue to knock back it slightly just to remove a little bit of the paint if I want it lighter in certain areas. And then back to my opera rose. You can see that I'm just dotting in some much darker paint just across the bases of each flower, and we're starting to get a bit more shape and form, or the impression of it anyway. Then continuing to dot in until I've completely filled in all my hollyhocks and leaves. And now onto the sea pinks. I'm going to paint them in exactly the same way, going over the masked areas. I don't mind if I leave some little bits of white showing here and there. That actually adds some sort of freshness to the painting. And then the sea pinks with a nice rich mixture of the opera rose on either side, just to balance out the composition. So far it's just the two colours, Opera Rose and Sap Green, but I hope you can see that where I've been layering up the Opera Rose, I've got quite a lot of variation, both in hue and in tone. And this really rich mixture for the sea pinks really stands out nicely against the earthy, chalky bank. And then I can put in a final touch or a final layer of Opera Rose and just darken up the bases of the flowers a little bit more, and this really makes them pop. Again, just checking across my whole plant systems and making sure that everything's dark enough. And the last thing that I'll do is mix up a rich mixture of perylene green, which is a nice sort of dark greenish black, and I can use that to put in a few darker stems where they're in shadow below the leaves and below the flowers in places, and this hopefully would just balance out the tones for me a bit more. So focusing on keeping this darker green, just sort of in the low-lying plants, maybe bringing a little bit up into the hollyhocks where some of the larger blooms are causing shadows on the stems. But I want to keep it fairly fresh where the hollyhocks rise above the chalky, earthy bank. And I think that's just about finished. I may have to do a little bit of balancing of tones still where the hollyhocks grow out from the bank, but I'm going to have a look at it first and remove the tape. Once I see it with a clean white border, it helps me to look at it with fresh eyes and to sort of see whether I've judged the tones correctly. And I'll put it against a cleaner board, which will make it even easier to sort of see. And I'm looking at it now, and I think I need to just carefully darken up between the stems of the hollyhocks and the sea pinks a little bit more, just to put them into shadow and to sort of ground them into the earthy bank a little bit more. So I'm going to mix up a fairly pigmented but quite watery mixture of indigo and burnt sienna, a little bit of burnt umber, and just see if I can dot that in and around the stems and just darken those areas up slightly, but without making it look too sort of obvious. I need to sort of blend it in, if you see what I mean. Because what had happened was that the chalky earthy bank and the stems all began to look the same sort of tone, so I need to balance that out with some darks because that's quite a shadowed area, and I can add a bit more indigo to my mixture and make it really nice and dark just under the hollyhocks, and that draws attention to them and I think balances the tones. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. And if you click on the bell icon, you'll receive notifications whenever I post a new video, which is usually twice a week. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.